Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to really jump into our last and final unit, which is ecology. So we're going to start off today with our wildlife journal. So I will either put up the eagle camera in the background and you can watch the eagles and make observations, or if you had another organism that you are following, the link in the daily agenda will take you to all of the cameras and you can choose yours from there. We're going to do entry 6 today, which is May 10th. I will be kind of collecting these at a certain point, so please just make sure that you're keeping up with our entries. And then we're going to jump into ecology and talk a little bit about what ecology is and food webs. And so we're going to start entry 25 today. We will continue on with it on Thursday as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and click right in. And let me adjust this a little. There we go. So our essential question for today is, which population in an ecological community is most important? So open up your journal to a fresh page and take a minute to pause and jot this down for entry 25. Which population in an ecological community is most important? And if you're unsure about what those terms mean, we're going to cover them as well. So starting off, the whole unit is called ecology. What is ecology? And eco comes from the Latin word oikos, which means home. And so logi means study. So ecology put together is the study of Earth's homes, in this case for living things. So you can see kind of the picture on the right. It highlights a lot of different elements. So researchers that are looking at ecology study populations, which are groups of organisms that are of the same kind or same species living in a particular area. They study communities and they study ecosystems. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those three vocab terms in a minute. And really, as I go through this, what I'm going to end up doing in class is going through the notes and just talking through it. And then I'm going to give everybody about 15 minutes to look through the slides and create your own notes page. So instead of pausing on every slide to have you guys write things down, I'm really just going to walk through it. And then I'm going to have everyone take 15 minutes to scroll through the slides and jot down what they would like to jot down. I've also included a picture of my own notes page if that's kind of a helpful guide for you as well. So for now, I would say just kind of sit and listen, and then when we get to the part about note taking, you can figure out what notes you might want to take. And so when I talked about researchers in ecology studying populations, community, and ecosystem, it's really building off the levels of organization that we've been learning about before. So we have started off as small as the atom with a nucleus and electrons interacting with one another, to molecules, to the parts of a cell, building up tissues and organs and body systems, all the way to the organism or individual level. And so then we move beyond that to talk about populations, communities, and ecosystems. And all three of those areas kind of moving beyond the organism itself is ecology. So if we remember organisms to populations, individuals or organisms express traits that are written in their genes, right? Their DNA code translates into the genes and traits or your phenotype that you express. And this builds into populations, where we talk about natural selection, evolution acting on populations. It cannot act on an individual alone. But in groups, trait frequencies or the genetic change or the genetic prevalence in certain traits changes due to that natural selection process. So that's where the change is coming over time. Do more of them, look lighter or darker or taller or shorter or longer nose or bigger feet, whatever it might be. There's a shift due to natural selection in those trait frequencies over time. And so that's where we go from a population. Now, a population lends into a community. A community is where you take a population of organisms and interact them with other populations of organisms. So a community in general is where each kind of organism affects every other organism in a common location. So you're looking at multiple populations coming together in some kind of centralized location. So to put it into perspective, on the left, I have an example of our Kenmore community, which is where, the city with which Inglemoor is. And there's many interacting professionals. They're not particular species, but professionals in the area, right? There's mechanics, there's grocery store clerks, students, teachers, everything from dry cleaners to bakers to sanitation engineers and so on and so forth. So there's different groups that all have their kind of purpose and role to make the Kenmore community function. When we look at a community of living things, we have many interacting groups or populations in the area, and they each have their own important role or niche. So, for example, I want to you to think about right this moment, and in class I'm going to do a chat activity, but which populations might live in a desert community? So thinking about those players that would take place, organisms serving specific roles, what populations might live in a desert community? Once you have something in mind, here are a couple of examples, and there's so many to choose from. Here's just a couple. So perhaps a rattlesnake or a cactus, in this case a hawk, brittlebrush, or some other, dry loving plant, grasshopper mouse, or a specific type of grasshopper. So these are just some examples that might live in a desert community. They're all populations or would have populations in this area, and they all serve a purpose or a role. They have a defined niche in the group. And again, there's tons more you could pick from. That's just one example. So when we put it all together, an ecosystem is all of the biotic or living things and all of the abiotic or non-living things interacting in the area. So communities are all of the kind of living organisms. And when you combine that with all of the abiotic or non-living things like rocks and water and air and wind and temperature and light, all of those things, that's when you have a full ecosystem. It takes into account both the biological or biotic communities that live there, as well as the non-living things, the abiotic factors. So let's take a peek and do an example. Here is an ecosystem. In this case, it's kind of a marine or wetland ecosystem. And thinking about all of the living things in that ecosystem. What are the living things in that ecosystem? And again, you're really thinking of the populations that fit into this community. There could be deer, raccoon, frog, fish, dragonfly, turtle, grass, cattails, hawk, trees, ladybugs, ferns, lily pads. All of those things fit in that category, and I'm probably missing some. When I think of all of the non-living things, these are the abiotic factors. So these combine with our living communities in the area to create the ecosystem. So I could say sun, I could say water, I could say air, I could say rocks if I can see rocks at the bottom. I could say light. I could, if I knew the temperature, I could say that. All of those are abiotic factors, are non-living things that affect the organisms that live there. So again, the ecosystem as a whole is a combination of both those living and non-living things. So how do we show interactions within the ecosystem? Because clearly different species interact with one another. And so we can organize it in a number of different ways, in this case, a food chain. A food chain is a linear series or a line of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass. One organism is going to eat another organism. And so that energy passes from essentially the prey to the predator, right? The thing that's eating is getting nutrients and energy from the species with which it is eating. And that's signified in these arrows here. So the brittlebrush gets eaten by the pallid-winged grasshopper, which gets eaten by the grasshopper mouse, which gets eaten by the red-tailed hawk. So this would be an example of a food chain where it's a sequential line of, who eats who, and as you move along it, energy and nutrients gets transferred. And if we zoom out, it's really not just a chain in the ecosystem. And if I follow along, the chain that we did was brittlebrush to grasshopper mouse to hawk. So that is one chain in this much larger web. The web is many food chains linked together to show the relationships in the ecosystem. And so you can see it gets a little bit messy. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of different things coming together. So both food chains and food webs use arrows, and they show the movement of energy and matter through the ecosystem. So wherever the energy is going, it is signified in an arrow. And as you move up the web, or as you move along the chain, each level is called a trophic level. And we're going to talk about trophic levels in a moment on the next slide. Troph as a part of a word means nourish. So trophic means pertaining to nourishment. And so as one thing eats another, right, they're getting nourishment. They're advancing in a trophic level. So I would say the first trophic level is kind of the bottom at the base. And these are your producers. These are organisms that make their own food, aka do photosynthesis. So plants are an example of producers. There's other things that do photosynthesis, certain algae, things like that, but plants are a good start. And then again, following the arrows, the grasshopper will come along and eat the plant. It is considered a primary consumer. And this little one with a circle here, that means primary, if you're doing it shorthand. And so these are organisms that eat plants for energy, aka herbivores, right? There are plant eaters. They are called primary consumers because they don't make their own food, but they are getting food from producers. And then the mouse comes along and eats the grasshopper, so they are considered secondary consumers. They come along and eat the primary consumers. So they have to eat other organisms for food. They cannot eat plants. So they're going to be carnivores or omnivores because sometimes they might eat plants, but they also eat meat of some kind as well. And then along comes the red-tailed hawk, which eats the grasshopper mouse, and that would be a tertiary consumer. They are the ones that come along and eat the secondary consumers. So this is kind of how we signify them and can give them specific names based on where they fit in a food chain or web. So the producers are the ones that make their own food. The primary consumers are the ones that eat the plants. Then from there you have secondary consumers eating the primary and tertiary consumers eating the secondary. And all along the energy and nourishment transfers as you move up those levels. So As I had discussed at the beginning, I'm going to pause during class and allow them 15 minutes with which to create their own notes page, kind of highlighting some of those key ideas and key vocabulary from the page. If you'd like, I did put a photo of my own notes page in here if it's helpful. Feel free to use it as a guide. I tried my best to capture everything from the notes. If yours looks totally different, probably okay. I'm just asking you to capture the notes that we took in class as we moved through. And that's about as far as we're going to get today in class. The goal then is, we've introduced ecology and the parts of study within. We've introduced how organisms can interact in a food chain or a food web. And we've discussed how energy transfers within an ecosystem and trophic levels. So your homework job today, is to go along and finish entry 25A. So going back to the questions in the summary once you've gotten your notes page. On Thursday, we're going to be doing the B page. So save that space. We're going to be creating a food web of our own in class of the marshland. Thanks, everyone.